Steve in Edinburgh, Scotland writes to me, "Hey Paul, can you give us the history of the digital lens from Genesis? I have one and want to know how it came into be and how it works. So I would appreciate it." Okay? I can give you a brief history of that. Genesis was a time that I had sold PS Audio in 1990 and moved my family to Vail, Colorado to work with Infinity founder Arnie Nudell. And Arnie had left Infinity and wanted to start a new loudspeaker company, and he wanted some company. So we had been friends for many years, and he called me and said, "Hey, are you interested? Because if you are, sell your company, move your family, come up here, and let's build some crazy good stuff together in loudspeakers." Okay, so in 1990, that's exactly what I did. And in 2 or 3 years of working at Genesis, we had developed the entire line of speakers. They were being produced in Canada by API, Audio Products International, that made Mirage and what else do they make? Sound Dynamics, I think. And I had also designed all the electronics for the subwoofers, the servo systems, and frankly, I was bored. So, being the kind of person that has to be always doing something, creating, designing, doing something, I really got invested in digital audio because digital audio only came onto the scene, in the mid-'80s. And here we are, in the early 90s, and it hadn't been around for that long. And it sounded pretty bad. There were snippets of them that were good, but not that much. And one of the products that we had that was really spectacular was a product called a Jadis. Jadis is a high-end company, it used to be, I don't know if they're still around, in France. And they made the most gorgeous CD transport I had ever seen. And this CD transport sounded better than any of the CD transports that we had had by a lot. And I didn't know why. And that drives me bananas. So I got my scope out, I started, what are the differences? And one of the first things I noticed was it produced a beautiful square wave. Normally people don't care about the quality of the square wave coming out of the digital signal. It looks like a square wave, right? So sometimes it has ringing, it has this and that, it's sharp edges, and it's not very big. Well, this was huge. This was, 2 or 3 volts coming out, but it was like somebody that had analog experience had designed it. And I thought, that's interesting, probably by design. So I started experimenting with that, and we had been working on some digital stuff. And I started experimenting with taking some of the stuff that we were working on at the time and cleaning up the waveform and making it look real pretty like the Jadis, and it helped. So I started thinking about that. I thought, interesting. So the shape makes sense. Well, just about that time, our guys over at, our buddies over at Audio Alchemy, Doug Goldberg, Mark Shifter, I think they were at Audio Alchemy at the time, they had started talking and jumping up and down about a number of things. And one of them was jitter. And I started to understand what jitter was. And jitter is timing errors. And I started to realize that all CD transports and CD players, whether you're using a CD player as a transport or a transport as a transport, it outputs a digital signal and a clock. And that master clock drives the DAC. And CD players were notoriously bad. Their clocks were filled with jitter. They were moving around. The CD player is putting out faster and slower data because as the laser reads the data off the disk, it's going through error correction. It's doing all this stuff. And what's coming out of it, isn't all that great. And now let's add in At that same time, I also knew that the Mark Levinson Company had a FIFO at the input of their DAC. I don't remember which model DAC it was. And a FIFO is a first in, first out, kind of like holding cell. And it pops in and then it comes back out. Now they did that for a whole bunch of different reasons, and it was probably kind of effective. So I started putting all this together. CD players were terrible in terms of their master clock, lots of jitter coming out. Levinson had this FIFO, which you kind of put it into the shift register, basically, is what it is. And then they output it with another clock. And this other clock was run by a phase lock loop, which kept everything aligned. And I don't want to get all that technical, but for those of you that know what I'm talking about, this phase lock loop would just keep everything aligned, but they got less jitter by clocking this FIFO, and I forgot how long the FIFO was, but it was long enough that they could actually make some headroom with jitter. I put all that together and I thought, you know, if you were to take the output of a CD player and store it, in other words, use that CD transport to rip the signal into a hard drive, you do so without a clock. And that's true. Anytime that you rip something, you do it without a clock. That data is in there, and when you output it from the hard drive, the way that you output it, whatever mechanism you use, kind of becomes your CD player, and that provides the clock that drives the DAC. So the jitter coming out of the CD transport, if you got rid of that clock and got rid of the jitter and just stored the data, then you come back a year later and play it back. You could do so without any jitter if you had a fixed clock and a zero jitter clock. Okay. And that was the idea that was in my head. So I thought of it kind of like a water tank. If you fill a water tank up, you can output constant pressure into the city. And it doesn't matter if the tank is full or empty. It doesn't matter how fast the water's coming in. If there's enough in it, if you have this reservoir of enough in it, then you can output steady water. And the same is true if you were able to store, like they did in the FIFO, like a hard drive would do, and then output it with a fixed clock. And I went to this young engineer who we had just hired to do our displays, Bob Stadther, who has been our chief engineer, I think, for 20 years now. And I went to Bob with this crazy idea. I said, here's what I want to do. I want to build kind of like a digital water tank. We take the data out of a CD, we throw away the master clock, we put it into a temporary holding cell, and then we take our time and output it with a perfect zero jitter fixed clock. And at the output stage, which is completely isolated from power supply and everything from everything else, we create this beautiful square wave like the Jadis transport. Okay? And Bob processed all this information and said, okay, I could do that. And he did. This project turned into, of course, a huge deal. But we wound up with, I think, 0.5 megabyte of storage, of RAM storage. And that was a lot back then. And we had to, I'm not going to get into all the technical difficulties, but that's what we wound up with. Takes it in, we throw out the clock, we store it in this 0.5 megabyte of RAM, and then we take our time and output it. There's a little bit of latency. That's okay. Well, who cares? We're not, this is 2-channel audio, right? And it comes out perfectly. And the difference was staggering. We sold thousands of those digital lenses. And it was Arnie's idea for the name. He said, well, you're focusing everything down to a perfect point. Why not call it a lens? Okay. Arnie nailed it. And today, every PS Audio digital product has a sophisticated version of that built into our products. And that's why we say there's digital lens technology inside of all of our products that just deletes all the jitter. And it does it in basically the same way that we started with back in the early 1990s. So there you have it, my friend. The history of the digital lens. Thanks.